it's really hot in here. What's the temperature anyway? Whoa, it's like over 30 degrees. There's no air conditioning either, okay. I think I better get a fan if I'm gonna do this. Okay, let's put on high power. Oh yeah, it's much better. You know, it's kind of noisy though. Okay, I have an idea. Here, let's see. How about this? Yeah, okay, that's cold. That's maybe a little bit too cold. Okay, how about this one?
And now it's time for another episode of Music is a Journey.
No, not this one. How about this one? What is going on? Yeah, no, okay. How about this?
Hi there, Peter Scope for Music is a Journey. Yes, it is very hot here this summer. We are up in the mid to high 30s every day, and even with the air conditioner on inside, it's still pretty hot because we're trying to be eco-friendly and not lowering the air conditioner too much. Still here. I got the air conditioner on behind me. I'm sweating. What can you do, huh? Okay, anyway, today I want to talk about 1983 and what was happening in heavy metal in that year, because the way I see it, 1983 was a very important year and a very exciting year for heavy metal. First of all, to point out the obvious, I mean, this was the year that Quiet Riot's Mental Health album reached #1 on the Billboard Top 200. Quite a feat for a heavy metal album. Def Leppard were close behind with their album Pyromania reaching #2. Only Michael Jackson's Thriller was keeping Def Leppard from the top, so it's some pretty stiff competition there. We also saw a lot of other great things happening in heavy metal, and so what I want to do is just go through what was happening in different scenes and how things were developing. Let's take a look at that. So first of all, we're going to take a look at the new wave of British heavy metal, which is really one of the important movements that basically got going in the second half of the 1970s, really broke out around 1979, 1980, and then from there on over the next few years, bands were still popping up here and there. One of the most important bands, probably the most important, iconic, legendary bands to come out of this movement was, of course, Iron Maiden, who released their debut album in 1980. By 1983, things were already in place. The classic lineup was there. Bruce Dickinson had joined the year before for the Number of the Beast album, and then Nico McBain took over on drums for Clive Burr, and the classic lineup fell into place there with their fourth album, Peace of Mind. And just as a little aside note, Peace of Mind has my favorite Iron Maiden song of all time, Revelations, on it. So I really love that album. And of course, from Number of the Beast, Peace of Mind, through to 1984's Power Slave, the second concert I ever went to. Still have the t-shirt upstairs somewhere, packed away neatly. And throughout the 80s, the next couple albums in the 80s, you know, Iron Maiden became basically one of the top heavy metal bands of the 80s and eventually of all time, still recognized as a legendary band. And of course there was Def Leppard. Def Leppard had already released two more hard rock styled albums with On Through the Night and High and Dry. Their producer for High and Dry was Mutt Lange, who then brought them into the studio to record Pyromania and really did a number on changing the band's sound and giving it this big, brighter, in-your-face, loud, stadium-type sound, which was a very key point in changing the sound of, let's say, popular heavy metal, because from there on in, that kind of bright, loud production sound really started to dominate the releases of a lot of the popular bands throughout the 80s. And as we said, Def Leppard's Pyromania reached #2 on the charts. This was also the first album they recorded with Phil Collen on guitar, so that's pretty cool. He was there to see them rise up to the top. All right, but other important bands too. Of course, we had Raven, and they released their fourth album, All for One, which guested Udo Dirkschneider of Accept on some vocals there. And All for One is said to be the last of Raven's classic sounding albums. For their next album, which was the first one I got, Stay Hard, their sound was being changed, and I actually didn't really like Stay Hard. Couldn't understand what all the fuss about Raven was when I heard that. But anyway, they later on came back and tried to revitalize their classic sound a couple of albums later. But yeah, at that point, All for One was out. Saxon, they had been releasing an album every year since 1979. So 1983 saw Power and the Glory, their fifth album, which also actually did really rather well for the band, getting them placed on the charts in several countries, even near the tops of those charts. Okay, some other bands to consider. Girl School released Play Dirty, their fourth album. This is also said to be the point where Girl School's classic sound started to curve. It was the beginning of the curve into the more, shall we say, pop metal or commercial metal sound. That same kind of sound that you would hear, like, for example, of Bon Jovi types, or that more kind of brighter, lively, fun, glamorous hard rock style that some bands were moving into. For example, Coney Hatch and Headpins, they started off with a much more raunchy hard rock sound. By 83, 84, they were also going into the more big poofy hair, the glamorous look, and more brighter sound, keyboards as well. But anyway, that was Girl School's fourth album, came out at that time. Other new wave of British heavy metal bands, one very interesting act, a band called Satan from Newcastle upon Tyne, same town as Venom. They had been around for a few years and finally released their debut album, Court in the Act. Other bands to release debut albums, there was Savage with their album Loose and Lethal, Grim Reaper with See You in Hell, and also Tokyo Blade released their debut album as well. Still, there would be other new wave of British heavy metal bands releasing albums over the next couple of years, and a lot of bands who were part of the scene but only managed to squeak out singles or EPs or demos and that kind of thing. But it was a really important scene that greatly affected where heavy metal was going to go in the 1980s. Okay, let's just take a look back now at some of the older bands from the 1970s. Black Sabbath. 1983 saw the release of Born Again, the album they did with Ian Gillan of Deep Purple on vocals. Story behind this is kind of interesting. Ian Gillan had his own band called Gillan, and they were basically, I think I read something about they owed a lot of money to the tax revenue services, and they were basically trying to avoid getting into trouble. But one day the tax collectors came in through the front door of the studio, and the band just dropped everything and ran out the back door of the studio. And that was basically it for Gillan, if the story I read is to be believed. So Ian Gillan went out with Tony Iommi and Terry Butler of Black Sabbath one night, and they had a lot of drinks. And next morning, Ian Gillan's manager calls and asks, "What on earth do you think you have done?" He says, "What are you talking about? You have just signed a contract and agreed to sing with Black Sabbath on their next album." Yeah, well, apparently it was actually supposed to be a side project. Black Sabbath had parted ways with Dio, Ronnie James Dio, and they were without a vocalist, and it seemed that the original idea was that the three of them, Tony Iommi, Terry Butler, and Ian Gillan, would get together and record a side project type of album. But as is often the case when you get big names like that putting out an album, the record labels say, you know what, let's just name it after your band and it will sell that much more. And so, as I understand it, that's what happened. The side project got turned into the next Black Sabbath album. So, such was Born Again, and there's just a whole lot of stories about what happened behind the making of that album. But one interesting point is, they used, what's his name now, they used Richard Branson's mansion, the billionaire behind Virgin Records. They used his mansion to stay, and they often rehearsed and recorded and played loud. And nearby was a church, and the priest at the church came over one time to say, "Look, you guys, do you mind not playing while we're doing service, because the sound of the music is reverberating through the walls?" And so that was what led to the song Disturbing the Priest. However, what's very interesting about that is the melody, "Sweet child with an innocent smile watches closely all the while," is actually from an Ian Gillan Band song, Scarabus, which was their third and final album as the Ian Gillan Band before Ian Gillan quit his own band and started up Gillan. So that's kind of interesting if you hear Disturbing the Priest by Black Sabbath and Scarabaeus by the Ian Gillan Band. You'll see the similarities in the verse melody. Okay, so there was Black Sabbath. Born Again was what could have been something really spectacular. Some people really do like it. When I first heard it, I thought it was great. I loved the music, really heavy riffs. Gian's vocals were so full of power. Side 1 especially I really liked. But the production, the quality of the sound is not great. And there's a story about the Def Leppard tour bus. They popped that cassette in while they were driving, and within a short time, I guess it was the road manager, he just popped it out and threw it out the window. And a lot of people said it just sounded terrible. But there are still people who think it is a great album. And I mean, I heard it on cassette way back when. I've got the CD. I actually think it's pretty good. But yeah, sure, there's room for improvement in the sound. Anyway, that was Black Sabbath and, of course, Ian Gillan. Dio, as we said, he had left Black Sabbath. 1983 was when he put out Holy Diver, his debut album as a solo artist. And that just remains as one of the classic heavy metal albums of all time. When I first heard Rainbow in the Dark on the radio, my only Black Sabbath album I had at that time was Mob Rules. And so for me, Dio was the voice of Black Sabbath. So here came this, heavy metal song on the radio with these synthesizers in there playing this melody. And then Dio starts singing, and I was thinking, oh, wow, Black Sabbath have gone and put synthesizers in their music? Oh man, what is the world coming to? But of course, that was Dio. Okay, then we also take a look at Ozzy Osbourne. He was out with his third album, Bark at the Moon. Randy Rhoads, of course, had tragically passed away in a plane accident, right? And so it was Jakey Lee who came in on guitar for that album. I didn't particularly, that album doesn't really stay with me as an album I really need to hear again and again, but it is an important album for me because a very dear friend of mine who passed away from cancer a few years ago actually gave that to me on cassette for my birthday when it came out. So it does have that special memory attached to it. But anyway, Ozzy Osbourne, Kiss, they had come out with their Lick It Up album, which basically, after a bit of a dip with that, was it Songs from the Elder? Whatever, which wasn't really all that successful. They came back with their classic sound for the 1980s, so Kiss were going back up again. A lot of the old bands were in between albums. Judas Priest had released Screaming for Vengeance in 82. Defenders of the Faith was coming out in January 84, so they were in the midst of, wrapping up a tour and then recording their next album. Of course, at that time, Judas Priest were really riding high. Defenders of the Faith was just going to keep them moving as one of the great heavy metal bands. Whitesnake, I believe Whitesnake was also between albums, between Saints and Sinners and Slide It In. So 83, I don't think they had any releases at that time. Triumph were also between albums. Never Surrender, was that 1982 or 83? I think Never Surrender was 82, and then Thunder 7, their seventh album, was 84. So Scorpions were also between albums. Blackout in 1982, which really started to catapult them towards success. 84 with Love at First Sting, boom, they were way up there. But Accept, their compatriot band from Germany, Accept came out with Balls to the Wall in 1983, and that, I remember that song being played on the video channels late at night. I mean, that was just killer, that opening, that riff there with the guitar, the band members moving in unison to the riff. That was just really cool. But anyway, one other band that was also between albums, Venom. They had done their Welcome to Hell and Black Metal, and then they were working on the next album, At War with Satan. So 1983, I don't think they had any full-length albums out. They may have done some other releases at that time, or maybe not yet, but anyway. Okay, so what else was happening in the heavy metal scene? Well, let's take a look at the American scene. We already talked about Quiet Riot. Of course, Randy Rhoads had left them to go off with Ozzy Osbourne, so they had brought in Carlos Savazzo on guitar and released Metal Health, which just, boom, skyrocketed them up into the #1 position. And as I recall, an entertainment program that was on at the end of the year talking about what was happening in movies and music and so on, they said that 1983 was the year that heavy metal became a household name, and that was certainly thanks to Quiet Riot and of course also Def Leppard. But another important band to mention is Motley Crue, whose Shout at the Devil album, I think I read that it was up to number 17 on the Billboard charts, and of course that was Motley Crue's big album after their debut album the year before, and they became one of the huge bands of the 80s. Also, Poison formed, LA Guns formed in 1983. LA Guns, of course, being the band which later on, there was a spin-off which became Guns N' Roses. Let me see here. Night Ranger came out with their second album, Midnight Madness. Still more of a hard rock band anyway, but they had that song Sister Christian, which became a huge hit. And because basically any music with the loud guitars and so on and the long hair and everything at that time was being categorized as heavy metal, Night Ranger were kind of squeaking in there as well, even though they were more of a hard rock band. But anyway, Night Ranger. Y&T came out with Mean Streak. For me, that was a great album. I heard the song Mean Streak on Monday Night Metal Shop one night, and I was blown away. I had to find out who was this band. Rushed out, got the cassette, got a big back patch there for my denim jacket, Y&T Mean Streak album cover on there. Still thought that was great, because not many people in my high school listened to Y&T. I think it was me and my best friend, and that might have been it anyway. So I was really, really happy to find that band. I wasn't in listening to Poison and Motley Crue and like that, like everybody else, because I found my own bands to listen to, and Y&T was one of those. Who else here? Twisted Sister came out with their second album, You Can't Stop Rock and Roll. And Rat released their EP. Pantera came out with their debut album, Metal Magic, in 1983. And I thought that's really interesting. I don't have any Pantera albums, and I thought, you know what, I think I gotta get this one, but it seems to be only available on LP. I don't have a record player, so I guess I'm gonna have to just listen to it on YouTube then, and unless someday they release it. But I think all their early recordings are not being re-released at all, just because they made it so big after changing their sound. Let me see here, who else have I got on my list? Pantera, Rat. Great White's EP came out. I saw Great White open for Judas Priest on the Defenders of the Faith tour in 1984. But yeah, they released their EP at that time. And also the band Steeler. Steeler I actually knew about but never really listened to. But they're very interesting because, of course, they feature Yngwie Malmsteen on guitar. Also Ron Keel on vocals. And I think it was Rick Fox also was in the band. And then I forget the other guy's name, but basically all four band members, they went off. Ron Keel, of course, started Keel. Yngwie Malmsteen went on to Alcatraz, later on solo. Rick Fox went to Wasp. And Dagnimit, if I can't remember that other guy's name now, but he's also a fairly well-known musician from the time. But anyway, it was kind of like Steeler were like a super group before the members became super. Okay, that basically covers the American scene. Yeah, I know, there are a lot of bands that are missing, but they're going into another part. So let's just take a quick look up in Canada to see what was going on. Helix came out with their third album, No Rest for the Wicked. This album was also the album that really set them off on the course that, the next few albums in the 80s, they would become a pretty big band. Killer Dwarfs released their debut album. Anvil came out with their third album, Forged in Fire, and of course Anvil is one of the really important heavy metal bands, with that kind of branching off from the traditional heavy metal sound and moving into the extremes a little bit more, inspiring a lot of the thrash bands later on. And another band who did that was Exciter, who had recorded their debut in 1982 but released it in 1983, Heavy Metal Maniac. So that was another important band. You can just see how here in 1983 so many bands releasing debuts or second albums were really making an impact on the heavy metal scene. Looking around the world, we also find bands like Sortilège, I guess is how you pronounce it, the debut EP from the band from France. Crocus came out with Headhunter. Crocus, of course, they started out as more of a kind of prog band in the mid-70s, but changed their sound to a more hard rock sound. And I think Headhunter was following after, there was Metal Rendezvous, a couple other ones, and just around this time Crocus were also climbing up in the scene. Swiss band that. Loudness in Japan, they were still recording albums mostly in Japanese at this time, but they were just one album away from becoming an international success. AC/DC released Flick of the Switch, which is not really commonly known as one of their better albums, but it falls in between For Those About to Rock, which was my first band cassette I ever owned. And the Fly on the Wall album, which really brought them back up again. So flick of the switch, yeah. AC/DC, of course, from Australia. Michael Schenker, he released yet another solo album, except I mentioned Europe. Now, Europe is one of the really kind of more softer, keyboard-friendly type melodic hard rock so-called glam metal bands, but they released their debut album in 1983, which I didn't know because I didn't hear anything about them until the Final Countdown. And Heavy Load, I think they were also out of Sweden. They had already started releasing albums in the late 70s, so they also released an album around that time. All right, so it is at this point here now, we've covered the classic bands, we've covered the new wave of heavy metal, we've covered this rise in the glam metal scene, or maybe the more pop metal type scene. And now we're going to take a look at some of the other subgenres that started to kick off around 1983 or earlier. All right, bands who formed in 1983, according to the list that I got: Sacrifice, Razor, two big thrash bands, two of the big four thrash bands to come out of Canada. They formed in 1983. Suicidal Tendencies, which were one of those crossover bands moving between punk and thrash metal, they released their debut in 1983. Vader, well known as a death metal band now, but they actually formed in 1983, as far back as that. I mean, they didn't release any album until the early 90s, right? We're also looking at, of course, Kirk Hammett left Exodus in 1983 to join Metallica. They released their classic debut album, Kill 'Em All, which is basically the introduction of thrash metal to the record store shelves, as I see it. Exodus took a couple more years before they got their debut album out. But of course, with Kirk Hammett joining Metallica, that meant that Dave Mustaine was off to do his own thing, and so he actually formed Megadeth also in 1983. Again, it would take a couple of years before they would get their first album out, but anyway, very important. You have Metallica releasing their debut, Megadeth forming. The thrash scene is really starting to burst out here in 1983. Other bands, Coroner, who also didn't start releasing albums to the late 80s or so, they formed. Death, the band one of the most important bands, probably the most, in the development of the death metal subgenre, they formed in 1983. Bathory, let me see here, Bathory formed in 1983, and of course 1984 released their debut album, which is regarded by many as the beginning of the whole black metal movement. So very important to see Bathory forming in 1983, giving credit to that year as being a very important year in the history of heavy metal music. All right, also checking the list, Hellhammer, who would later become Celtic Frost. They actually formed the year before, but 1983 they did their recordings for the Hellhammer Apocalyptic Raids EP, which I actually used to have on cassette. It was quite a listening experience, that. Honestly, I preferred Celtic Frost and Morbid Tales and To Megatherion. Slayer, of course, debut album, Show No Mercy, came out in 1983. Still leaning more towards that new wave of British heavy metal sound, but of course Slayer, one of the big four, and to this day one of the most important heavy metal bands, in there with the likes of Metallica, Megadeth, Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, and those ones, so one of the big ones. So Slayer's debut came out. And I think we also said Exciter, Merciful Fate released their debut, Melissa, and Possessed, one of the other important bands in the development of death metal. Also, they formed in 1983. So we see the thrash metal scene, the beginnings of the black metal scene, and the first bands to develop into the death metal scene. All this is happening around basically 1983, some forming a year or two before, but basically 1983 is that year where those branches start popping out or beginning to grow out. Now, there are two other subgenres that are very important to consider in 1980s heavy metal, and one of them is power metal. So, just a few of the power metal bands. We saw Savatage release their debut album. Manowar released their second album, and Virgin Steel also released their second album. And then in the progressive metal department, progressive metal hadn't really started going yet, except for, of course, some of the things you would hear on albums by Rush or Triumph or some of the other heavy bands that were around in the 1970s. But as a separate subgenre, identifiable subgenre, the earliest release we have is the Queensryche EP, which they released in 1983. And of course, Queensryche, along with Fate's Warning, and later on Dream Theater, would go on to be some of the most important founding bands in the progressive metal subgenre. So I think that is everything on my list. What an amazing year that was, you know, heavy metal reaching the top of the charts, the whole glam scene taking off, the British new wave of British heavy metal scene flooding everywhere, the beginnings of thrash coming out, you know, the earliest formations of black metal, the bands who would develop death metal, all this was happening around 1983. So that's why I think 1983 is such an extraordinary year for heavy metal music, and why I wanted to make this video to tell you about it. Okay, that is all for this one then, and I'm going to be back with a completely spontaneous idea for my next video, which I did not plan at all. Just hit me. So hopefully you'll stick around for that one. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and hey, if you think of any other important bands that I missed, want to put in the comment section, go ahead. Of course, Van Halen released 1984 at the end of 1983, but that was also kind of signaling the change of the more pop metal sound too, wasn't it? Okay, that's it then. Thank you again for watching, and I hope you're all staying relatively comfortable and safe. Alright, see you in the next video. Take care.